She falls to her knees in the middle of the desert, nothing but sand and the feeling of hope slipping away with the wind. She screams in this emptiness, the trauma of absence. It is a truly powerful shot, one that even in isolation, taken completely on its own, feels uniquely poignant. A shot that perfectly evokes this sense of desolation, of barrenness, of void, an image that captures the unbearable emotional weight of lack. On the surface, it seems suspect to claim that a film like George Miller's Mad Max Fury Road could ever evoke this idea, considering that in all other ways and at all other times, it is perhaps one of the most excessive movies of the last 10 years, or maybe ever. And yet it is in scenes like this, shots like this, that Fury Road reminds us that it is a film not about excess, but about absence. That it can only be so excessive because there is so much emptiness for it to fill. But sometimes that absence becomes overwhelming, leaving us in a position where all we can do is fall to our knees and scream into the nothing, hoping perhaps that something, anything, will scream back. The world of Fury Road, and even the entire franchise, is one of desolation and decay, whether that is the moral and societal decay the original film was focused on, or the ecological decay of Fury Road that has left the world dry. It is a vision of the future that feels all too familiar, as modern-day headlines speak of lakes drying up and summers getting hotter and hotter each year, as our ability to do anything beyond pure mitigation slips further and further out of our grasp. All this while fascist strongmen utilize this decay to consolidate power for themselves, making the very concept of truth just another thing to be exploited in the process, and leaving those at the bottom of the pile to suffer and die. In the face of all of this, I think it's understandable why we begin to question if anything has meaning at all. And in this lack of meaning, a good lens to look at Fury Road through is famed psychologist C.G. Jung's concept of individuation, defined by Jungian psychologist Martin Schmidt as, quote, the process of self-realization, the discovery and experience of meaning and purpose in life, the means by which one finds oneself and becomes who one really is. For Jung, individuation was the ultimate goal of life, the goal of psychological development. It is contact and harmony with the self, that being the indescribable totality of body and mind, the conscious and unconscious, the God image, the union of opposites and a dynamic force which pilots the individual on his or her journey through life. With these and other Jungian concepts in mind, Fury Road becomes a search for meaning, truth, and even divinity in a world seemingly defined by absence, falsehood, and the profane. It becomes a story that not only has a sense of profound emotional significance, but also a strange sort of spiritual significance. So today, we're going to look at Mad Max Fury Road through the lens of C.G. Jung in a search for substance within emptiness. And the best way to start doing that is to look at a character trying to define meaning by himself. Immortan Joe follows well in the Mad Max tradition of very weird villains, from the Toe Cutter to Master Blaster and Tina Turner. Mad Max's villains have always been notably odd and over-the-top, ridiculously evil, violent, callous, yet weirdly entertaining. And Immortan Joe is no different. He's even played by the same guy who played the Toe Cutter in the first Mad Max. But while the Toe Cutter was kind of just rambling nonsense for most of that movie, Immortan Joe is much more comprehensible. A strongman dictator who wears a scary mask and controls the waters underneath his territory, the Citadel. And with that control over such a basic necessity that is rather hard to come by, Immortan Joe solidifies his power and controls anyone that needs it, not just by giving of what he has, but also by restricting access to it.
Do not, my friends, become addicted to water.
He could just let the waters flow, but that would make his control over them worthless. He needs to be able to take it away so that the people have no choice but to rely on him to eventually give it back. Beyond simply controlling people by controlling this basic resource, though, Joe uses this control over the water to go even further. Before he releases the water, he says this:
I am your Redeemer. It is by my hand you will rise from the ashes of this world.
And by doing so, prefacing this act with claims of transcendence, his releasing of the water feels less like pulling a lever and more like a mystical conjuring, a miracle by a god. This water serves almost as a proof of Joe's divinity, his access to something beyond this world of absence and lack. He defines what meaning is. He gives meaning to this world by promising that it is but a necessary step on the way to something better. And that meaning is inextricably tied to him and his ability to control the water. In his book Nature, transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson once said that nature is thoroughly mediate. It is made to serve. It receives the dominion of man as meekly as the ass on which the Savior rode. Essentially, nature is a sort of intermediary between the human and the divine, and so through nature, man connects with God, and this seems to be the way that Immortan Joe looks at nature. The water, being nature, connects these people to Joe, being God. Partaking in the water, this gift that Joe deigns to give his subjects, is in its own way a connection to that divinity, that promise of more. Joe thoroughly deifies himself, makes himself seem divine and transcendent, and this brings to mind the Jungian concept of the persona, the part of the personality which we show to the world, named after the masks worn by Greek actors in antiquity. Your persona is simply how you act and identify yourself in public and towards other people. For Immortan Joe, this persona is obvious. It is that deification, presenting himself to the world as a powerful divine force with control over nature itself. But what's interesting is that while the persona typically is something that doesn't fully represent the ego, something that in Jungian psychology is the totality of our personal conscious identity, Joe's persona very much is his ego. Or at least he seems to believe that it is. We can take Joe's mask as being a sort of symbol for his persona, something that he has to put on before he shows himself to the public and that makes him seem otherworldly and frightening. But that mask is also seemingly a breathing apparatus. He needs that mask to live. It isn't just his persona, it is a key part of his life. In that way, we can understand Joe to have confused his persona with his actual identity. He not only presents himself as a god, he thinks of himself as one. And identifying with your persona in Jungian psychology is very dangerous. Jung himself said that, quote, "The aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona." And so identifying yourself with your persona is itself antithetical to the process of individuation, the process of finding true meaning in life. But Immortan Joe doesn't think he needs that, because he defines meaning, and meaning is himself. All of this ultimately serves one purpose for him that comes through in the way he treats his wives. He looks at them as breeding stock, their only worth being in their ability to produce healthy, preferably male children, and he presumably seeks to achieve that goal through less than consensual means. He creates this position of power for himself by dominating nature and controlling people indirectly, and then uses that position of power to dominate and harm human beings more directly, women and nature both being nothing more than objects for his use and potential profit. And he doesn't seem to think of any of this as wrong. Joe has crafted a persona that justifies those harmful desires, makes his abuse of people, particularly women, seem natural and morally acceptable. Joe has no desire to find truth when it's much easier for him to just make it up for himself and his personal benefit. He creates meaning, promises purpose, and people stay underneath him because they have to, because he's the one who controls the water, and he's the one who promises something better beyond this life, and you can only access it through him. And if he doesn't have those answers, if he doesn't have that power, then you have to face the possibility that there is no meaning to find. Immortan Joe promises paradise, Valhalla, heaven, whatever you want to call it, and everything else around us in this wasteland promises nothing but sand and lack. However, both nature and his wives, those two things he most directly controls or seeks to control, start to fight back. Joe's wives run away with his Imperator Furiosa, writing on the ground of their quarters, "Our babies will not be warlords." They refuse to be dominated.
You cannot own a human being. Sooner or later, someone pushes back.
And Joe goes after them because they are supposed to be his property. They are his possessions, and for them to run away is to push back against that idea, essentially to push back against his persona, making it imperative for him that he recaptures them. The film itself even questions later on if how much Joe does to get them back is even worth the effort.
All this for a family squabble. Healthy babies.
He just wants to own them the same way he owns the water. But it's not even just his wives that fight back, it's nature itself. The sandstorm that Joe and his war boys drive into reads as a visual expression of divine rage, something so ethereal, so dark, so violent and devastating, the kind of natural destructive power that could only be conjured up by the same being that flooded the entire earth, not the man who pulls a lever to let water flow. The natural world of Fury Road is not one so easily controlled. It is actively hostile to human beings, in fact, barely hospitable, and only in some places. It is hardly something that meekly receives the dominion of man. All around Joe is the fact that his idea of meaning, of truth, is false, but he refuses to let it go, because the idea of his godhood is as necessary to him as the air he breathes. And so he continues to define truth for himself, creates and reinforces hierarchies that allow him to act with impunity no matter how many people it harms. And while some push back, and we'll talk about them more a little later, others seem totally okay with this continuing on exactly as it is. When talking about who accepts the truth of Immortan Joe's world, there are two characters that come to mind: Nux the Warboy and Max the Madman. Nux is most obvious. He's a warboy, essentially a soldier. He directly benefits from Joe's version of the truth. Max, on the other hand, doesn't directly benefit from it, but he is completely and utterly uninterested in doing anything to change it. He doesn't care, and in that way, both Nux and Max are characters who have no desire whatsoever to change how things are or challenge Immortan Joe in any way. And like Immortan Joe, this has a lot to do with their individual personas and their struggles to keep them separate from their actual identities. Let's start with Max, self-described as
a man reduced to a single instinct: survive.
Max cares about no one but himself. When we meet him at the very beginning of the movie, he is all alone, and his primary goal for most of the movie is to go back to that state. And just taking the information we have from this movie, because who's even to say if it takes place in the same universe as the other films or not, this seems to be due to the fact that Max did once have other people he cared about, but they died, and now haunt him with words about how he promised to protect them, promised to keep them safe. His desire to distance himself seems directly related to that failure. It's not unlike his character throughout the rest of the series, consistently wary of helping others, particularly when there doesn't seem to be any benefit to himself. But here, it's not born from a purely selfish cynicism, rather it comes off as a defense mechanism of sorts, an attempt to protect himself from being unable to protect others. This comes through in choices like his unwillingness to tell Furiosa his name, something that he has no practical reason to keep hidden in a place like the Wasteland, but that would begin the process of forging a connection that he doesn't want. And so the only interaction he allows himself to have with others is purely pragmatic, only those relationships that can benefit him and only when he's given no other option. He initially sides with Joe over Furiosa when he's forced to choose because he thinks that's what will benefit him most at the time, only deciding to side with Furiosa when she convinces him that he has a better shot with her and the wives. And of course, Furiosa can give him what he actually wants.
You want that thing off your face?
The muzzle that's on Max's face for a good third of the movie serves, much like Immortan Joe's mask, as a symbol for his persona. That wild, feral madman, dangerous, not to be trusted, to be kept at a distance. That is the identity he wants to show to the world. That is how he wants to be perceived. That is who he's come to believe that he is. However, this muzzle is also incredibly restrictive and, if nothing else, supremely annoying. Max doesn't actually want it. He doesn't necessarily want to be treated like this, but that's the persona he's shown to the world. And the only way to get it off is to trust somebody else, at least on a base level. Max's worldview is entirely self-centered. Much like the other movies, he only gets involved in all of this by accident. This is not his story and he wants out of it. But if he wants the muzzle off, he has to be in it. He has to work with others against the world that put that muzzle on him in the first place. The irony of Max's distanced persona is that his unwillingness to get involved in anything that doesn't directly affect him causes him to be affected by those things. He was kidnapped by Immortan Joe to be used as a blood bag for his war boys. He became a part of this because of the current systems of power. He exists within this world dominated by these horrible exploitative people just as much as everyone else does. The only difference is that he's decided it's not worth trying to do anything about it, because he doesn't think there's anything to do but protect yourself as best you can by isolating yourself as much as you can. But in that pursuit of isolation, people get hurt. In his attempt to steal Furiosa's war rig to escape all of this, Max shoots one of Joe's wives named Angharad. It's just a graze on her calf, nothing too serious. It's only later during an action sequence when Angharad, climbing on the outside of the rig after having saved Max and the rest, slips off of the very leg that Max shot and falls, being run over by Immortan Joe's own vehicle. Max imagines the dead body of the little girl he couldn't save, and as the wives beg him to turn around and go back for her, he can only say,
She went under the wheels.
Did you see it?
She went under the wheels.
A small action taken only for his benefit that didn't seem to cause any serious harm at the time, only for it to get an innocent person killed later. And Max can't even bring himself to say what happened beyond the obvious. He didn't just fail to save someone, he played a significant role in their death. That is the consequence of Max's persona. That is the consequence of someone looking out only for themselves, even if they aren't actively hurting anyone. Small, selfish actions causing greater tragedy over time. The warboy Nux, on the other hand, is actively trying to hurt others. He directly benefits from Immortan Joe's conception of the truth, not only because it gives him a certain level of power, but also because he needs that promise of something better beyond this world. The warboys have half-lives, seemingly due to some kind of radiation poisoning that requires them to need regular blood transfusions. As such, they are a lot closer to death than regular human beings, and as such, seek meaning in death much more aggressively. They live their entire lives for a glorious death. Nux and the other warboys rely heavily on Joe's vision of reality, his promise of Valhalla, because without it, they're going to die and it's going to mean nothing. And through Nux's white body and face paint, along with the thick black around his eyes, he embraces that as his persona.
You're already a corpse.
Nux and the other warboys make their closeness to death their entire identity, painting themselves like skeletons seeking only to die in service of Joe, and thus, hopefully, finding a more meaningful existence on the other side. For the warboys, life is meaningless save for how you die. But this belief is belied by the warboys' call to others to witness those glorious deaths as they happen. Something being witnessed makes it feel more meaningful. It reinforces the sense of purpose one has in doing it by way of support from others around them as they do it, particularly when it comes to a more abstract, unprovable belief like that dying gloriously will bring you to Valhalla. The promise of that afterlife is not enough. The belief must be reinforced by this strange sort of echo chamber egging you on. The warboys have to look back before they move forward, look back to call for a witness, because if they are looking forward, they will see nothing. Nux almost dies 3 times. The first is within the divine rage of the sandstorm, attempting to blow up his own car and himself in order to stop Furiosa and her war rig. He looks back at Max on the outside of the car to call for a witness, but he doesn't die. Max stops him before he can ignite his car. The second time he almost dies is when he manages to get to Furiosa on the war rig, but is immediately put at knife point. Here, he can't look back. He has to face down the possibility of his death with no witnesses to reinforce the meaning of that death.
He's just a kid at the end of his half-life.
No, I live, I die, I live again!
And he tries desperately to defend and justify his place in all of this.
No, I am awaiting!
You're an old man battle fodder, killing everyone and everything.
We're not to blame!
Then who killed the world?
And the third time, Nux is egged on by Joe himself, witnessed by Joe himself. After he has failed to die twice, after he has been forced to face the reality of his death, the reality of his place in all of this, only his admiration for his god could help make this attempt feel meaningful.
Put a bullet in her skull. Stop the rig. Return my treasures to me. And I myself will carry you to the gates of Valhalla.
But he fails. Again, Joe calls him mediocre and leaves him behind. 3 times he almost died. 3 times he failed to die. 3 times he failed to embrace death, and throughout all of this, Nux's white paint has started to wear off, showing his real skin underneath. The next time we see him, the black around his eyes has almost completely faded away as he lies in shambles and fear. One of the wives finds him there, the one named Capable. He tells her of how he's failed, bangs his head on the metal floor, crying. He tells her that the gates were open to him, that he should have died, went to Valhalla, feasted with heroes, but Capable tells him,
I'd say it was your manifest destiny not to.
He tells her about Larry and Barry, a couple of growths on his neck that he's named and drawn faces on.
If they don't get me, then the night fevers will.
It's sad, even a little bit pathetic, so scared of death, so terrified of dying without glory that he makes these murderous lumps into his best friends, desperate for them to have any more meaning than they really have, desperate to make them more important than they really are because he's afraid. I think all the war boys are probably like that. So they hide behind these personas, embracing death, proud of it, seeking it, because it gives them more power over it, makes it feel more meaningful, makes it feel like it matters, a necessary step towards transcendence, something, anything better. But he can't hide behind that persona for very long before it fades away in the face of reality. He's going to die, and it's probably not going to mean anything. Max has given up on the possibility of meaning, so he refuses to engage with anything beyond what is necessary for pure survival, and Nux is desperate for any meaning at all, embracing whatever he is given by whoever offers it. And these parts of themselves are so strong, they have forged entire identities around them to hide from the simple fact that they're both just scared and alone. But neither of them can exist in those realities for long. The masks must come off eventually, the personas must break down, but there is a place in between these two extremes. Rather than giving up on meaning or embracing whatever hollow meaning comes first, there is a balance, a rejection of this false meaning in the pursuit of real truth. Mad Max Fury Road is not a film about Immortan Joe or Nux the War Boy or even the Madman himself. No, Fury Road is about Furiosa the Imperator, the traitor smuggling Immortan Joe's wives out of the Citadel in the hopes of bringing them to the green place of many mothers, the home she was stolen away from as a child. We don't hear much about this place. In fact, the most information we get about it is that name, the green place of many mothers, evoking in this desolate wasteland a matriarchal society of abundance. It sounds like a sort of Eden, a paradise within nothingness where all fear and pain falls away. Furiosa's journey of returning to the green place is a search for redemption. Not taking the prequel into account, it's still easy to assume what she means by that. It's not hard to imagine that as Joe's Imperator, she's had to do some things she regrets doing. And to find that redemption, she's searching for that Eden, that place where she can find herself again. In this Jungian reading of the film, Furiosa is the only one actively trying to achieve individuation. As with Joe, Max, and Nux, she wears a mask of sorts in the form of this black grease she smears over her forehead and eyes, but it's already off by the halfway point of the movie. She has to reapply it before communicating with the bikers in the canyon. It is something she only has when she has to project a sense of identity towards others, but it's not nearly her entire identity. She knows that it's not, and doesn't bother to reapply it after this point because she has no need to. And this search for individuation, this search for redemption, is what makes Fury Road feel almost mythic. Like a myth that is told in the wasteland itself, the tale of Mad Max and Furiosa. Maybe it's not quite a myth definitionally, and trust me, there are a lot of definitions and theories about what actually constitutes a myth, but it at least has the spirit of myth, the urgency, the power of myth. Science writer Philip Ball describes myth as, quote, where we go to work out our psychic quandaries, to explore questions that do not have definitive answers, to seek purpose and meaning in a world beyond our power to control or comprehend. And that sounds a lot like what Fury Road is trying to do, even if I don't think it would meet Ball's standards for what defines a myth. And C.G. Jung himself had a lot to say about myths, particularly in regard to his ideas about the conscious and unconscious mind. For Jung, creation myths like those in Genesis were, quote, symbols for the creation of consciousness out of the unconscious. And all myths are essentially that for Jung, stories about the process of breaking free of the unconscious, the internal world of childhood, by establishing consciousness in awareness of the external world of adulthood. But forging consciousness is just the goal of the first half of life. The second is about reconnecting with the unconscious. As mythologist Robert Segal says, quote, the goal of the uniquely Jungian second half of life is likewise consciousness, but now consciousness of the Jungian unconscious rather than of the external world. One must return to the unconscious from which one has invariably become severed. He goes on to say that, quote, distinctively Jungian problems involve the failure to re-establish oneself internally. Jungian problems stem from excessive attachment to the world one enters upon breaking free of the childhood world, the external world. To be disconnected from the internal world is to feel empty and lost. Individuation involves reconnecting with the unconscious world, and in that way we can understand the citadel and the green place as symbols for the conscious and the unconscious respectively. Furiosa's childhood world was the green place, and in being taken away from it was forced to become conscious of the world outside of it, a place ruled by men like Immortan Joe, disconnected from the internal and therefore empty and cruel. And now, in pursuit of true meaning and individuation, in pursuit of herself, Furiosa has to return to that childhood world that is now fuzzy in her memory, unclear, but she knows that it's there. It has to be there.
But if you came from the West, you passed it.
This place, almost like a sort of underworld, dark and barren, more inhospitable than where they left. It's more akin to author Ursula K. Le Guin's description of the collective unconscious as the common darkness, the place of dragons, creatures of evil, threatening and inexplicable, that live within us all. This used to be the green place, but now it is blue. Now it is nothing. Furiosa returned to the unconscious on her quest for individuation and meaning and found a vast, stark landscape of eternal night. Not the easy answer she was looking for, not a paradise or an Eden, but rather the inarguable truth that everything eventually decays and dies. For Jung, that was a necessary thing to accept in the second half of life, an important step towards individuation, but perhaps Furiosa's ego just wasn't strong enough to face it. Not when most of her life has been defined by a desire to return to this place, to find it again, to find herself again, only to find that it is gone. And in reaction, she falls to her knees in the middle of the desert. Nothing but sand and the feeling of hope slipping away with the wind. She screams in this emptiness, the trauma of inevitable absence. Jung himself described the process of individuation as a painful one, calling it, quote, an heroic and often tragic task, the most difficult of all. It involves suffering. The ordinary, empirical man we once were is burdened with the fate of losing himself in a greater dimension and being robbed of his fancied freedom of will. He suffers, so to speak, from the violence done to him by the self. And Furiosa's pursuit was ultimately for herself. She helped the wives escape Joe, sure, but at the end of the day, she was going to do this no matter what. She even says herself that she's tried to do it many times. But coming into contact with the unconscious and the larger self forced her to look beyond herself at the larger truth it is in service to. Her screaming in the desert is seemingly a desperate attempt to reestablish herself as an individual, to say, I am here, but she is just as small as the grains of sand that surround her in the face of never-ending decay. And so Furiosa chooses to take the wives and the people she's met, former residents of the Green Place, and go across the salt plains ahead of them, essentially choosing to abandon the conscious world altogether, believing that there is nothing there for her or anyone else. The best they can do is hope that something, anything, is beyond the salt. Nothing is more personal, more unshareable than pain. The worst thing about suffering is that you suffer alone. Yet those who have not suffered, or will not admit that they suffer, are those who are cut off in cold isolation from their fellow men. Pain, the loneliest experience, gives rise to sympathy, to love, the bridge between self and other, the means of communion. We all have the same kind of dragons in our psyche, just as we all have the same kind of heart and lungs in our body. It means that we can communicate, that alienation isn't the final human condition, since there is a vast common ground on which we can meet, not only rationally, but aesthetically, intuitively, emotionally. Max tells Furiosa that hope is a mistake.
If you can't fix what's broken, you'll go insane.
He says it as though fixing what is broken is impossible. But as Furiosa and the others drive across the salt, he hears the voice of that little girl he couldn't save. He promised to help them. He sees her walking across the salt in the other's direction. He catches up with them, and he has a plan not to go across the salt because according to him there is nothing out there, but rather to go back to the Citadel left unguarded by Immortan Joe. To not delve deeper into the unconscious, but instead turn back with this awareness of the unconscious in hand and return to the conscious. Robert Segal says that, quote, the ideal is a balance between consciousness of the external world and consciousness of the unconscious. The aim of the second half of life is to supplement, not abandon, the achievements of the first half. And the best way to do that is by leaning on the relationships you have forged in the first half of life. Jung says that, quote, the self is relatedness. The self only exists inasmuch as you appear, not that you are, but that you do the self. The self appears in your deeds, and deeds always mean relationship. Forming and nurturing relationships is the lifeblood of individuation, and as Le Guin puts it, it is our common darkness, our pain, our shared inner dragons, our humanity that allows us to form those bonds, diving deep into the personal in order to connect with the other, finding the unknowable divine within the unknowable self. The meaning of all this is in what we do for each other. And so Furiosa turns back in order to return. And in the end, returning is a hard-fought battle, a struggle against forces of the external who have a vested interest in things staying exactly the same. And in this struggle, all four of the characters we've spoken about come to the end of their journeys. Immortan Joe dies after Furiosa attaches a hook to his mask, a representation of his persona, remember, and rips it off, the face underneath coming with it. As a ruler of the external world, his entire identity was built on how he presented himself to the external world, built on his self-given status as a god to the people below him. He can't survive without the persona, either emotionally or literally. Nux dies too, But he dies without a mask, face clear of that white paint and the black around the eyes. To make sure the others can get to the Citadel safely, he deliberately crashes the war rig while he's still inside to block the way. Silently, he calls for a witness. But he's not looking back at what he's leaving. He's looking forward towards the people he's giving a chance. It's not for him to go to Valhalla, to some place better than this. It's to give other people a fighting chance to make this place better. And with that chance, Max saves Furiosa's life. Having been stabbed during the battle, Furiosa is now on her last legs. Her body is running out of blood, and Max, as a universal donor, uses his blood for a transfusion. And he tells her his name.
Max. My name is Max.
Far from living only for his own survival, far from giving up on the idea that the world can be made better, far from distancing himself from everything and everyone, Max gives of himself to save someone else who wants to make the world better. Growing up in a religious household, I can tell you just how important the idea of heaven and hell is to those who believe in it, how focused those who believe in it can be on what comes after. Our existence on this earth, our lives, are only as good as where it gets us once it's over, built on the desperate belief that there must be something, anything, better than this world. And beyond the salt, there may very well be something. Perhaps heaven, perhaps Valhalla, perhaps the green place. It may be there beyond where you can actually go. A place of meaning, truth, and divinity rather than this place of absence, falsehood, and the profane. I cannot say for sure, but I refuse to believe that getting there is all that matters, because I am alive right now. And I choose to believe that we can make this life, this world, this place worthwhile right now. Sometimes we need to escape, to find what's missing, to confront that absence, look it in the eyes and scream. But we must return too. We must return in order to see that what we thought was missing was there all along. We just weren't looking in the right place. Meaning, purpose, God, they weren't in the green place. They weren't beyond the salt or in heaven or Valhalla or standing above us at all. Maybe they were always here. Fury Road is a film about searching for something better by running away from where we are. It is about attempts to escape into insufficient beliefs and false hierarchies in a bid for meaning and purpose within a world of absence and fleeting hope. Looking outward in the hopes of finding something better outside of where you are, outside of yourself. But for Jung, coming to that place of individuation, finding meaning, meant looking inward. It meant diving deep into your personal unconscious, breaking through to the collective unconscious, and through that to the indescribable self, to the collective bedrock of human experience that we cannot fully understand. But it is only through it that we can truly connect with others, and it is only through connection that we can make things better. And that is a choice we have to make as individuals first. Ursula K. Le Guin says that, quote, "Only the individual can get up and go to the window and draw back the curtains and look out into the dark. Sometimes it takes considerable courage to do that. When you open the curtains, you don't know what may be out there in the night, maybe starlight, maybe dragons, maybe the secret police, maybe the grace of God, maybe the horror of death. They're all there for all of us." It can be scary to look inward. I think it's natural to fear what you might find there, but it is only through that exploration that Furiosa found the ability to free the waters of the Citadel and change her world and the worlds of many others. It was only through that inward examination, confronting that emptiness, that she was able to find not only herself, but other people. She may fall to her knees in the middle of the desert, nothing but sand and the feeling of hope slipping away with the wind. She may scream in this emptiness, the trauma of absence, but in the middle of that absence is something. Within the desolation, there is something undeniable right in the center of the frame. Within that absence is Furiosa herself. Hey, thanks for watching this video about Mad Max Fury Road. All the names scrolling up the screen right now are my lovely patrons, and for only $2 a month, you too can not only become a patron, but also get access to an exclusive companion video to this one where I explore Fury Road's themes of violence, nature, and femininity, and the connection between all those things. You'd also get early access to all future videos, and you'd be doing a lot to help me continue making any videos at all, if that is something you are capable of doing. You can click the link on the screen or in the description and get access to all of that for only $2 a month. Once again, thank you so much for watching this video. I'm already working on the next one where I revisit a series very important to my channel's history. I'll see you then.